Welcome back to Dion Talk. Don't let this equity mistake be the reason you end up having to work decades longer than you should have. This question comes up a lot, and every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific, I do a live stream that lasts as long as the questions do. So if you want your questions answered during a live stream, I will see you on Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific. But during those long live streams, a lot of times questions come up with, should I use my equity? Should I tap my equity? How should I tap my equity? What should I do with the money from my equity? And this comes up a lot in those long videos. And I've realized I've covered it in those videos a few times, but I don't think I've made a standalone video for those people who would never click on a 2-hour video. This is that video. I've explained it, and I don't think I was very clear. I probably should have used a whiteboard. And so in this one, I'm going to give you some visuals that say, here is why I don't touch equity and don't even like calling it equity. The way I've redefined it is the ability to add debt to an existing asset. And I've usually said something like, well, if you have a house that's worth $500,000 and you owe $200,000, you have $300,000 in equity, so you could borrow money. And we throw out so many numbers, it gets a little confusing. So the amount of equity is what matters, not whether it's paid off or you have a mortgage on it. So in this example, I'm going to use the example of a paid off property. Imagine you have a house. It is paid off and it is rented out. And when you collect the rents as a landlord who is an owner of rental properties, that's how I reached financial freedom. It takes about a decade. It doesn't happen overnight. It does happen over a decade, though. And you have equity in your house that you could take out and buy another rental or take out and buy an RV or buy a boat or do all those things that caused the 2008 housing crash. Or you could not touch the equity. And here's why I didn't. So the first idea is, let's say you have a house and you basically are making $2,000 a month in profit. You have it rented out, right? Let's say you have expenses of taxes, insurance. You have to set aside money for repairs, maintenance, and vacancy. So you're running your rental right. You're making $2,000 a month. Now, this can be a house that you bought that's all paid off, or a house where you have a mortgage on it, but the cash flow is $2,000 currently. So a lot of people will think, I have so much equity, I can go and buy another property. And they forget what this actually does to your cash flow. They're thinking about, I could have a big pile of money. The big pile of money can be used to buy the RV, to buy the boat, to pay for the vacation, or to buy another rental. A lot of times when we buy a rental, I've bought in 3 deals that were break-even deals that didn't make money for a year or two, and then made significant money once I either used the binder strategy, the area got better because the mushroom farm went away, or I had tenant turnover, or I added a closet to a den to turn it into a bedroom, right? It becomes a good deal. So a lot of times when we buy a rental, it's not immediately going to make a ton of money, but you were making $2,000 a month. That's the thing where people miss. So if you take out a mortgage, let's say you borrow $300,000 against your property, it's whether it's paid off or you have that much in equity to borrow, and you take out $300,000, you are going to have an $1,800 or so at 6% interest mortgage. Now understand, this is not about the math. This is about the concept. So yeah, you could create a fancy chart and show, well, it would actually be 1847. No, I'm saying you had $2,000 a month in income from this property. You got a big pile of money, but what did you do to the cash flow on the property? Let's say it was paid off because it's nice, clear, crisp numbers in our head. You're now making $200 a month, not 2,000. You've eliminated a stream of income to create a pile of money. You worked really hard to get the cash flow, whether it was borrow money and buy a place where the equity grew, or you borrowed money and paid off a property so the equity grew so that the cash flow was $2,000 a month. This is on average what most of my duplexes make. I'm a, like $1,100 a unit or so. So it's about $2,000 a unit on a duplex in profit because I've never touched the equity. Yeah, if I took the money out and I bought another place, I absolutely could have probably increased cash flow 5 or 10 years down the road. But I was looking for financial freedom in 10 years, not 10 years of investing to be redeploying equity to add debt to existing assets so that I can have more numbers to brag about, bigger unit count, more tenants to deal with. I wanted the right amount of cash flow from the least amount of units. And this came from not doing this because sometimes it takes a visual. Like here's a representation of how much money disappeared when you added the debt to the asset, when you took out your equity. Some people's brains work a little different, and we have to think, okay, so that's the income that's coming in, but what happened to my expenses? The idea is when we were making the $2,000 a month, when you had $2,000 in profit coming in, you probably had around, so I have this with a property, it's a paid off property. I could easily put a $300,000 mortgage on it, but I have to pay the taxes and I have to pay the insurance and I have to set aside money for repairs, maintenance, and vacancy. So I'm setting aside or spending, investing about $500 a month in order to have the $2,000 a month in cash flow. When you add the mortgage, a $300,000 mortgage added onto the property, which you can buy a boat or an RV or take a trip or build your reserves or buy another rental that takes a while to get up and running, you're going to add a mortgage of about $1,800. So our brain says, this is how I ended up with 200. No, this is not actually what happened. What you added was the payment, principal and interest of about $1,800 a month. In reality, your expenses, so we saw the income go from 2,000. We saw the income go from 2,000 a month down to 200 a month. That's a big drop. Now, what happens if we actually consider we had 500 a month in expenses? You add an $1,800 mortgage. Your actual expenses on that property are 2,300. You have about 200 left over, but this is how much your expenses increased by adding debt to an existing asset. Some people's minds will understand my income went down $1,800. Some people will understand that your expenses went from 500 a month to 2,300 a month. That's a pretty big jump. Hit to your cash flow, money going out the door, money you're responsible for if you go through an eviction, if you have a tenant turnover, if you have a tenant that stops paying and we have another pandemic and you can't evict. Some of the reasons why I don't touch the equity is because I want the cash flow. Now, it is a slow journey. It takes a couple of years in the beginning to save up the down payment for the next property. And almost every time I've had this conversation, it's been in one of those long videos where I'm breaking down numbers without charts, not able to clearly say, here's how much your cash flow went down for you to have the money to deploy. And yes, that could eventually turn into cash flow. Michael Zuber from One Rental at a Time did this on his first property on Norris Drive, and it lost money every month. Then there are the people that go to the other side of the spectrum and they say, okay, so this is the equity mistake that can make you work for decades longer than you have to. They'll say, well, if I don't want to add debt to a property, right, I don't want to touch my equity because that reduces my cash flow. Doesn't it make sense that I would want my properties paid off? Right, a paid off property is going to make more money. It's going to increase my cash flow. I've actually had that question come up so many times. It's entertaining. People will say, how much more cash flow would you make if you paid off your properties? And I did a whiteboard video where I proved that I would have to work 9 more years to get $5,000 more a month in cash flow. No thanks. So let's say you take the options of having a property that's worth $100,000 because you have $100,000 to either invest or to pay off the debt. So you have your $100,000 and you buy a property in cash, you own the whole thing. This is why so many people don't like debt. Look at how these colors play with our mind. What I would do and what I have done is take the $100,000 and buy a $400,000 asset or duplex that has $300,000 in debt. Look how heavy and weighed down on our brain this debt looks, because in both cases, we have $100,000 in equity. People think the paid off property, the $100,000, is going to make more because I'm not paying principal and interest. Well, the principal is going into money that's yours. The interest, while being a tax write off, is an expense. But what are the rents that come in on a $100,000 house, and what are the rents that come in on a $400,000 duplex? I make more money with a larger asset. But that's just the idea of, most people would think, if I focused and paid off my property, because you only have the $100,000 to invest. So if I paid off the 400,000, that would take years to do, take way more than the 100,000. So if we look at 1 year in the future on this same example of, you had $100,000 to invest, I had $100,000 to invest, you paid off a property that was worth 100,000, I purchased one worth 400,000, and we're 1 year in the future. In most years, homes appreciate about 5%. Now, I'm going to leave the debt the same, even though for a year now the tenant's been paying off a part of the debt. We're just going to leave it at 300,000. What is the equity or the ownership of the person who sleeps well at night because they think they own their property? Let me know how it goes when you stop paying taxes, or if you don't have insurance. If most properties appreciate 5% in a year, the $100,000 property that's paid off increased 5%, or $5,000 on the 100,000. The property with the mortgage that I didn't take the time to pay off the debt, I didn't even count the tenant paying off the debt. I just said, I put $100,000 down on a property. What is my current equity now, 1 year later? Same assumption. You know, when you make an assumption, you make an ass out of you, an assumption. We got a 5% increase here. We get a 5% increase here. Now this, yeah, on both sides, in Washington state where there is no R, we had 19% 1 year, 24% the next year, right? Inflation causes the dollar to lose value. So it takes a lot more money to buy these assets in most areas. But if you average it out market wide, appreciation on an annual basis is around 5%. My equity position increased by $20,000. Plus some of the debt was paid off. I didn't even count that. The person with the paid off property has $500 or $5,000. They're making the rents off of an asset worth $100,000. I'm making the rents off of an asset worth $420,000 that does have a mortgage on it. So if we game theory this out, in real estate, most properties tend to double in value about every 7 years, but I'm going to extend it out and say it took 10 years. If it took 10 years for a property to double in value, you had $100,000 to invest. I had $100,000 to invest. You paid off a property. I purchased a property with a $300,000 mortgage. At the 10-year mark, I still have a $300,000 mortgage. Yes, tenants would have been paying it down for 10 years. But just so you feel better about buying your place all cash, I'm going to say I still have the whole debt. The 100,000 became 200,000 on the paid off property. The 100,000 on my property with a mortgage that I haven't paid any of the principal down on, when in reality I would have. The tenants would have paid a ton of that principal down. Not half, because of the way amortization works, but a significant amount. My 100 became $500,000 in equity. So now if I sell or cash out refinance or take out a home equity line of credit, like I talked about in the first half of this video that I wouldn't do and haven't done, I literally have millions of dollars in my properties, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash flow, because I have not touched the equity. I could have a bigger portfolio. I could have more bragging rights. I could have more tenants, toilets, and termites to deal with than I want to. And the outcome wouldn't be as good. These were just some visual representations to get you to think when you hear people say, borrow, buy, die, always be borrowing. Yeah, there's a balance. When I was in growth mode, I wanted about 70% loan to value. So I wanted debt, but I didn't want too much. I wanted the right kind of debt. When I retired, I reduced that to about 50%. So I had a bigger safety margin or a cushion. What's the right amount for you? And are you confident in your ability to buy a deal that not only makes money, but makes enough money to compensate for that $2,000 in cash flow that became 200? I'm going to look at the questions really quick. I usually answer these on Tuesdays. Yeah, there's a lot of people who pull equity out sound snags. It's normal. I mean, there's just different, there's no right way to do it. This is just what worked for me. That's the question, Chester, is will the added debt on the property plus the added cash flow on the new property be enough to still have a great deal for both properties? That's what most people don't do. My friend Dan was going to buy a property and he didn't calculate the cost of the HELOC he was using for the down payment. That instantly made it a bad deal, which he then took and renegotiated a better price, later backed out on anyway. But the idea is you can either recycle capital, cash out, refinance, second mortgage, HELOC, sell for 1031, or you can recycle cash flow. Take the 2000 that was coming in every month without adding any debt to the asset. Continue to do things like house hack and work overtime. And in about 10 years, you never have to work again. Ever. Yeah. I don't brag when I say I have 18 rentals. I've got friends that have over 100. But I retired, was able to retire and make work completely optional in a decade. How long are you going to work based on what you do with your equity?